So we have let our apples dry, our plate dry. I came back and added some of the aqua that I have from my liquid watercolors. And now we're going to start on the background. We're going to start from the top down so that our hand doesn't get in any of the paint as we're going. So I'm going to use this towel as my inspiration. It has a beautiful color and I love kind of the textured pattern on it. So once again, I'm going to get my watercolor brush wet, coming to my blue. Any of the colors that you have chosen for this piece. Maybe your plate is golden like the one we looked at with Matisse. Maybe you only have red apples to choose from. So there are so many different ways that you could complete this piece with me this week. If you did not like the silver charger and the idea of using the grayscale, the neutral for the background, then you can always do more of a beautiful mixed watercolor painting where you have multiple colors underneath of the apples. I wouldn't do the exact color of your apples because then you're going to lose the vibrancy and the pop. You want the variety. So each time I'm coming back for my blue, I'm dipping the water before I load the color. And you can just see that I'm carefully going around the areas that I've already painted. And right now we're just getting that base color, so I'm able to go pretty quick to fill in the space. The colors are not bleeding together because you've allowed time for your plate and your apples to dry. So if you had not allowed that time, then maybe you would be experiencing some color bleeding, which would be a little frustrating, especially if you're trying to do realistic colors on your apples and such. This is a good time to practice your the way that you hold your brush, the way that you are controlling the brush, how you are moving it around your apples and your plate, how you're being patient as you're going around that and controlling what your color does. So you can see how quickly I'm getting this blue background down. I, beforehand, when I was sketching, took some time to put some lines behind my plate or under my plate and behind or under my yellow apple. I overlapped because I wanted to show that there was a difference between where the plate and the apples were sitting and where the fabric was. If you did not add the lines, that's okay. If you're not interested in adding additional pattern or color to your background, that is also okay. Our main objective was really just exploring with watercolor this week and trying to paint from the bird's eye perspective. So if you have done that, then you have achieved already what you needed to do. So my background is painted. It is not the same color. This blue is not the same color as my dish towel, which is fine. It's not a big deal. But I am going to come back now with a darker blue. To add some dimension to it. And my darker blue is from my liquid watercolors. If you are using the semi-moist watercolors provided for you, then you could either go back with the blue again on top, or you could see what black would do. And I'm going to come here just on top, and you can see right now that it is a very light overlay of color. I'm just going to slowly practice. You can see that some parts are more dry than others, and so some areas are going to bleed a little bit. If you do not like that and that's really frustrating for you, then I would just take some time to let your background dry. So that's the thing with watercolor is, you know, there are so many different techniques, and depending on how you want it to look when you're finished and how much control you like to have, that's going to kind of depend on how you are painting and the time you need to take. If you want a lot of control, then maybe you need to let things dry in between. And that way you can make sure that your lines go exactly where you're wanting them to go. Still working at the top. I'm trying to give this area a little more time to dry so that I don't get as many bleed marks as I did over here. This might be a piece where you do this in parts, and maybe you do the sketching the first day, and maybe the next day you come back and you paint an apple or two. This does not have to be done all in one sitting. And what happens if you do start to paint and maybe your colors are bleeding and you just can't control it? You can take a paper towel, just like we would clean our dirty watercolor paints. You could take a paper towel like this and blot it. You can see that there is some color still there, that I did not get that all the way taken care of. And if you don't want to practice on your large piece that I've cut for you, maybe you want to practice on one of the smaller pieces or on just a regular piece of paper if you're really concerned. I'm going to come back and see if we can take care of this area a little bit. We'll see what happens whenever we take that. So there is an amount that you can fix. Okay, I've basically erased where the water was, where my line kind of bled, and now I'm coming back with just my tip of my brush and kind of erasing that line, moving it out some. So there are ways that you can fix your piece and work with it. Maybe you are just not happy with it and you want to start all the way over, and that's fine as well. So I'm going to keep going with my darker blue. Remember, watercolor is a little different. You want to be able to move that color where you want it to go. And if that means that your brush is getting dry, there is such a thing as dry brush, but that is not the technique that we're wanting right now. So if your brush is getting dry, you're just going to redip it. I typically don't want a concentrated opaque color, so I typically put my brush in water first before I dip into the color. I'm going to come down to my bottom part now. This part was a little more wet, so I waited You can see my paper is rippling some. Once your watercolor is all the way dry and you've just let it sit in a safe place and you've let the air around it dry, you can weight it down so that it is not curving up, especially if you're wanting to hang it and you don't want it to be curved. Remember, if you are just using your semi-moist watercolor, then you can add value details with the same blue that you started with. It's very similar to what we did with the red apple. You just go back on top and use the color again. I have a slight advantage of having my liquid watercolors, so I wanted to see what that darker Prussian blue looked like. Getting near the end, I'm gonna actually, because so much of my paper is wet right now, I'm gonna turn my paper and come back to this area we were working on that bled. I wanted to show you how to fix that. So I'm gonna come back with my blue. I'm gonna let that dry for just a bit. I'm gonna come back and just add some of that texture here to the very edge. Fill in that space a little bit more. And this area is still wanting to bleed. There's just sometimes that's just what's going to happen on the paper. Okay, so we're going to let this background dry a little bit, and I'm going to get the blue out of my brush, reshape it, get that good point. And then I'm going to come with my brown to the middle of the apples and kind of finish adding some of that detail there. I can put my hand safely on the plate and on the apples because they're dry. And I'm just getting the very tip of my brush wet. If you have a smaller brush, you could get that out for this detail. I'm just getting a little bit of color. Controlling my water on my brush and dipping into this brown just gives me more of a direct color. It's not trying to spread out. It's not overly watery. And this is something that you could once again come back around to. You could do your background, set it over to the side and let it dry. And then you could come back and work on that. So I've come back and I have added the brown stem to my yellow apple. And now just take a moment and look to see if you are happy with your piece. When you look down at it, are you seeing a bird's eye view of apples similar to what Matisse did? Look at your background. If you're happy with your background, leave it. If you're not, then you can add more to what you're trying to do. And Hope you've enjoyed creating with watercolor.